Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about three things. One is, what is it that the public expect of the police? Secondly, how is the world changing, which changes the context in which you can deliver on those expectations? And finally, how are the police going to meet the expectations that occur in a context in which the demand upon them is changing radically? And essentially, I'm going to argue that public expectations of the police are still fairly traditional. They're still the sort of things that you would expect when you think about what public expectations of the police are. But the demand on the police has shifted radically. And the danger for policing is that starts to affect public confidence. If the work of the police starts to drift away from where the public expect the police to be anchored. And so I'm going to try to address that problem in my remarks. First of all, just a bit about us. We're the Police Foundation. We're an independent think tank that seeks to improve policing policy and practice through independent research and analysis. We seek to pose challenging questions and promote debate about policing. And we also provide consultancy and training on how to improve police practice and reduce crime. That's my little advert. We just heard about public confidence, and I just wanted to say this first of all, which that the figures from Northern Ireland are better than the figures from England and Wales. Most of the data I'm going to refer to today is from England and Wales, but I think the themes speak to the context here in Northern Ireland as well. Confidence in policing in England and Wales is also high, and the majority of people in England and Wales think that the police do a good or excellent job. Over 75% of people think that the police have confidence in the police service. They're confident about the ability of the police to catch criminals. They feel that that policing is much more visible than it used to be, and those figures have been increasing. So that's to sort of set this in the context of the fact that actually public confidence in policing is high, and we've heard today that is set the same in Northern Ireland. Of course, confidence in policing is not equally high in every community, and different communities will have more or less confidence in the police. And secondly, the real challenge here is that the world is changing, and this is the main point I want to make, that those changes may start to drag the police away from where the public think that policing has traditionally been anchored, and I think we need to start to address that. So what are public expectations of the police? You'll see here that public expectations of the police are extremely demanding and very broad. And this is a recruitment poster for the Met, where they were advertising for police officers. I think this is from the 50s. We want police officers to reduce crime, keep the roads safe, and indeed do everything. And E. Bittner described the public perception of the police role like this: something is happening that ought not to be happening, and about which someone ought to do something now. And really that is as broad as it gets. My own view actually is that it's a mistake to think that you can change that perception in terms of its breadth. I think ever since the police were established as a professional service, there's always been a broad remit. It's not just about reducing crime. It's never just been about catching criminals and reducing crime. It's always been a much wider remit than that. And there's a lot of talk about when can we say no, what can we stop doing. I think that there isn't really very much permission from the public to stop doing things. I think it's much more about, as people have been describing today, how do the police work better with other agencies in order to change the demand upon them. But there will always be a police role in mental health. It might be different to the one that it is now, but there'll always be an expectation. If the public sees something distressing happening, they'll call the police. I did it the other day. I had no idea. Maybe I should have phoned social services, but you don't phone. So you phone the police because you think, I want someone to come and do something about this, make sure this person's okay, they don't cause any problems. That is, I think, the very broad role which the police are left with. You'll see this. This is some work we did on the police and crime plans from all of the police forces in England and Wales. And this is a word cloud. It's very simplistic, actually, but all we did was took the headline priorities from the police and crime plans and put them up in this cloud. And you'll see that actually the headline priorities are kind of the traditional things that you would expect the police to be dealing with: antisocial behaviour, crime reduction, crime prevention, and so on. If you ask the public what the police should prioritise, and in this case they gave people a list of things that they, between which the public can select their favoured option, the public tends to choose the things which you might say are the traditional things. They say that the police should be about preventing crime, emergency response, and investigating offences and catching criminals. Note that keeping the vulnerable safe from harm, which with all the demand around public protection and dealing with vulnerable people, is rated rather low in that survey. But we know that's taking up an increasing part of police time. So that's the what in terms of what we expect the police to do. Quite a lot, a great demand, and quite a sort of traditional, if you like, view of what the police ought to be doing. In terms of the how, none of this will be very surprising to you. The most striking finding in the latest HMIC Commission survey by Ipsos Mori was the response to should there be a uniformed police presence in the area where you live, or how important is that? And 75% of people said it was important. And this is no surprise to anyone here. The public want uniformed, visible policing in their communities. And every survey that's been done on that shows that's absolutely the public priority. And so even though there are huge debates, particularly in academia, but also in policing as well, about the efficacy of neighbourhood policing, the public want it. And so if you want to retain public confidence, it's very, very hard to do so if you're going to shift away from this. Louise Casey did some work for the UK government on what the public expect from the police and the kind of style of policing that they want. And I won't go through this in any detail, but essentially what comes out of this is they want rapid emergency response, they want visible uniform presence, they want the police to be accessible, they want a better service for victims and so on. So all of this is fairly, I guess what you would say, this is not new. This is what you would expect the public to say about what they expect in terms of the way the police go about their work. But what I'm going to come on to now is changing world, because I think this dramatically changes the context. So we have over here what I think is a rather traditional view of what the police do. What I'm going to describe now is the nature of the changing demand on the police. This is the crime survey for England and Wales, which shows the huge drop in volume crime as measured by that survey, both in terms of acquisitive crime, this is since the mid-90s, and in terms of violent crime as well. So England and Wales, and these figures are also, it's also true of Northern Ireland as well and other jurisdictions, much less violent places, much less acquisitive crime than they used to be. And yet, what we find is that demand on the police has not decreased commensurate to that fall in volume crime. And what this chart shows, this is from the College of Policing, is that the cost of dealing with crime has not decreased by the same amount as the level of recorded crime. And what underlies those lines is that the cost of dealing with each offence has increased. And what that tells you is that there's less volume, but it's become more complex. And we know this, and we can see this also if we look at the growth areas in the offences which the police are dealing with. Police recorded sexual offences in England and Wales, huge spike in the last 2 or 3 years. Of course, that's not to say there are more sexual offences, it's just to say that there are more sexual offences being reported to the police. The number of and rate of sexual offences against children under 16, very significant spike in the last few years, which will not surprise people given the news agenda around this area. Domestic violence, also more and more people coming forward. These are cases reported to the CPS. Bit of a tail off in the last couple of years, but more and more people confident about coming forward, and so therefore more demand on the police. And of course, what all of those crimes share is their complexity. Their sexual offences, domestic violence offences are more complex offences to investigate, and so that increases the demand on policing. This shows detentions under Section 136 of the Mental Health Act. The blue line is detentions in health-based places of safety. The red line is detentions in police custody. These are detentions by police officers. So there has been a decrease in people being detained in police custody, which is a good thing, and we know that that's a policy objective across jurisdictions to try to reduce that. But there has been an increase overall in the numbers being detained, and that reflects wider changes in in terms of mental illness. And of course, everything that we've heard today would tell us that dealing with those issues is incredibly complex as well. This is the iceberg of fraud and internet-related crime. So this should say 15-16, we had about 600,000 frauds reported to the police in England and Wales. But we know from the crime survey they've just added a question on this, which revealed 3.6 million frauds, which the public reported in a survey had been affected by 3.6 million frauds. And so, those that come forward and report them to the police is only the tip of the iceberg. And when you add to that, in addition, an additional 2 million offences, computer misuse offences, which were not previously in the survey, that creates an extra 5.6 million previously hidden offences. So these were offences which were not recorded in the figures, and they now are recorded, and that's 5.6 million new offences being added to the crime survey, in addition to the 6.4 million, what I would call traditional offences, which were already in there. It's almost twice as much. And what that tells us is that even though we've seen this fall in crime, it's not as big as we thought. So the fall in crime, there has been a fall in crime. Everything we know tells us that, although it's always only have a partial picture. But it's nowhere near as significant as we might think. And I guess crudely you might say that the difference between the top line there, which is when you add those additional figures in, and the bottom line is modal shift. So these are crimes which are no longer taking place in the, if you like, the physical realm, and are taking place in the digital and online space. So I think there has been a fall in crime, but I think it's not as much as we thought, and there's been a big modal shift online. So that's the change in context, and we know that we have quite a traditional view of what we expect the police to do. So what does this mean for public confidence and trying to sustain those high levels of public confidence that we see in Northern Ireland and we see in England and Wales as well? Well, my first point is that public expectations are out of kilter with shifting demand. So you see here very little mention of the types of issues which I've just been describing when people think, what should the police be prioritising? And if you look at demand, this is from the College of Policing, it's their infographic on police demand. You'll see that there's a lot of crime demand in there, but on the right-hand side, there's all the non-crime demand that the police have to deal with. And in the middle is what they call ongoing demand, which is essentially the public protection work that the police are doing around victims of domestic violence, managing violent and sexual offenders in the community, safeguarding children from harm, all of that work. If you ask the public, just straight, what do you think the police should be doing? They wouldn't really say very much of that. And so this I think is a big challenge for policing. Having said that, if you put that in front of the public, they tend to agree with the kind of things that the police prioritise. So in this example, the public were provided with a list of different things and asked here, what should you prioritise? And they prioritised, safeguarding children, children going missing. So they clearly focused on the question of harm. And what that tells me is that a lot of this is about educating the public about what it is that the police do. And I note from the film about PSNI's work that came out earlier that there is some work going on there. But it's about trying to get a much greater understanding, public understanding about what it is the police actually have to deal with. And that will then feed through into the priorities that are set strategically. Because the danger is if police and crime commissioners or policing board or whoever goes out and asks the public, what do you want? They'll come up with something which may not be deliverable. And I think, so there's a big issue about leadership and public education about what it is the police are now dealing with. Secondly, in order to meet these expectations, clearly, a lot of this is, a lot of the offences around vulnerable people, the high harm offences, are disrupting the traditional policing model, because the traditional policing model, going back to Robert Peel, was mainly focused on harm caused in public places. And a lot of this is behind closed doors. And a lot of this is therefore goes underreported and is therefore highly complex and requires a different kind of policing to the policing we've traditionally been used to. Third, one way of trying to prioritize might be to just say, let's be completely evidence-led. And so you might do something which is, you'll have seen these, or you may have seen these, harm indices which have been launched, and there's been a lot of work on this. You create a harm index, you measure where most harm is in your areas, and then you focus your resources on the areas of greatest harm. And indeed, how could you argue with doing that? I mean, morally and in terms of efficiency, you would argue that's absolutely the right thing to do. But there is a danger if public expectations don't understand that that's what you're having to deal with, that the two things pull apart. So this is where you see the tension between a universal offer in terms of neighbourhood policing and a harm-driven index. A harm-driven index will lead you to focus on the most deprived areas, those areas where there are most problems, those areas where there's repeat victims and all of that. And you should argue, well, that's what we should be doing. But is there public permission to do that if it means that the visible police presence that the public expect disappears because you can no longer resource it? So there's always going to be this tension between public expectations of a universal service and the need to focus on harm. And I do think it's a bit simplistic to sort of try to say, well, a harm index is the solution to everything, because all of this exists in a political context and in a community context. But we can, I think, try to educate people. The fourth point, this is really the point that everybody's been making today about collaboration. And really, collaboration has become important because of complexity. I mean, complexity is the most significant sort of underlying driver behind everything we've been discussing today. And complexity, a more complex world, means a lot of the public service silos, a lot of the public service professions and the way they've been established no longer fit the society that we live in. And so that's why we need to break down those silos and work differently to deal with complexity. In some work we did recently, which is shown here, this shows a caseload of violent offenders, repeat violent offenders that were in a caseload that we were working with Thames Valley Police on trying to deal with. And you'll see here that many of the people in this caseload had mental health problems, drug misuse problems, alcohol problems, had housing problems, but an awful lot of them had all of those problems, and many of them had 2 or 3. And so dealing with this complexity requires much greater integration. And I think for policing, it's about connectivity at 2 different levels. There's a greater, in order to deal with this kind of complexity at the local level, individuals with complex lives, vulnerable people, and so on, you need much greater integration at the local level between policing and other local agencies. And in order to deal with the internet crime and the, if you like, the high-level stuff that I was describing earlier, you need much greater integration of policing agencies with one another. And so there's a connectivity at 2 different levels there that we need to sort of hold in our minds, I think, when we're thinking about dealing with complexity and policing. And my last point, and this is rather sort of obvious and simplistic thing to say, which is we need to work out how to police the internet. And I say that in a that's a rather unhelpful thing to say in a way, but the reason I say it is because I really think we have to ask ourselves some really profound questions about how you do that, and we really haven't caught up with the nature of the change. The internet drives a coach and horses through the traditional model of the traditional policing triangle of local offender, local victim, local police. And, that's worked quite well in sort of in terms of crime control, that's quite a sort of workable local model. The internet just completely obliterates that. And so how are we going to police in that context? And it seems to me it needs to be a completely different coalition of organizations and people in order to do that, including internet service providers, businesses, parents, policing agencies collaborating to an unprecedented extent, even post-Brexit and all the rest of it, collaborating, sharing information, doing joint investigations, all of that kind of stuff. And even going further than that into sort of, a much more coherent notion of kind of international policing. I don't know what the solution to that is, but it just strikes me that if that's where volume crime is going, we still don't have an answer to it, and I think we're only in the foothills of trying to address it. I know that the title of this discussion talks about measurement, and I'm very happy to talk about measurement in the discussion and performance measurement and so on, but I'll close there, and please, if you would like to follow our work, go to our website or email me or follow me on Twitter. Thanks very much.